Hi everyone, greetings once again. Welcome back to this educational channel on biology. I'm teacher Janet, and in this video we're going to discuss Form 4 Biology subtopic 13.2 on the urinary system. This is the second video about the urinary system. Here we're going to discuss the mechanism of osmoregulation and how a hormone called ADH or antidiuretic hormone helps us to regulate or control the blood osmotic pressure. Let's find out more. The learning standards for this lesson are as follows. 13.2 Urinary System. After this lesson, we should be able to synthesize the concept of homeostasis by using negative feedback mechanism in osmoregulation. So we have to understand the meaning of these terms, homeostasis, negative feedback, osmoregulation, and how do these processes occur. Now, in the previous video, part 1, we have already discussed the urinary system, that is the structure of the kidneys and the nephron, and this is the thumbnail for our video. So we have discussed the formation of urine. This is very important part of the video. How is urine formed? Through the three processes of ultrafiltration, reabsorption, and secretion. Now in this video, we're going to discuss the mechanism of homeostasis, which is involved in osmoregulation, which is the control of the blood osmotic pressure. We're going to discuss the role of ADH in the reabsorption of water in the blood. So mechanism of homeostasis and osmoregulation. Our body's water and salt content constantly changes depending on the intake of food and drinks. Alright? So on a certain day, you may eat salty food like salty potato chips and other salty food, and this will cause the salt content to increase in the blood. Certain days you may be also drinking a lot of water, eating the soups and broth, things that contain a lot of water. So again, this may increase or change the water content in the blood and in the tissue fluid. Now, so the body needs to regulate the water and salt content in the blood and the tissue fluid so that it is kept constant for the health of the cells, right? So osmoregulation is the process of regulating the water and salt content, two substances, water and salt, right, content in the body. Now the salt here, for example, sodium chloride. Sodium chloride is a salt, right, that we constantly eat. This can affect our blood osmotic pressure. It can increase. If we eat a lot of salt, it will increase our blood osmotic pressure, right? So that the blood osmotic pressure can be maintained at the normal range so that the cells can function optimally. So osmoregulation is achieved by regulating the volume of water and the content of salt in the urine produced by the kidney, right? So the body will adjust the volume of water and salt and the salt content in the urine that's produced by the kidney to ensure that the blood osmotic pressure is controlled and in the normal range. So here's a complete definition for the term osmoregulation. Osmoregulation is the control of the osmotic pressure of the blood and tissue fluid, which represents the internal environment that surrounds the cells, that bathes the cells, by controlling the water content and the concentration of salts, such as sodium chloride, in the blood plasma. So what is the importance of osmoregulation? It is to ensure that the tissue fluid and the intracellular fluid in the cells, or we call it the cytoplasmic fluid in the cells, are isotonic to each other, are of the same concentration, to avoid lysis or bursting of cells in hypotonic solution and crenation or shrinking of cells in hypertonic solution. Now take an example of a person who drinks a lot of water. Alright, so this water will be absorbed into his blood and will enter the tissue fluid. So the tissue fluid and blood will become hypotonic or more dilute than the cytoplasmic fluid in the cells. Now, if the kidneys of the person are not functioning, then after some time, due to the high water potential of the fluid, the tissue fluid or blood outside the cells, the water will diffuse from region of high water potential to region of low water potential in the cells. Okay, so water diffuses into the cells by osmosis, causing the cells to expand and burst. This is called lysis. Okay, and this will cause the death of the cells. Now, on the other hand, if a person doesn't drink enough water or eats a lot of salt, then his tissue fluid or blood will become hypertonic to the cytoplasmic fluid of the cells. Again, if the kidneys are not functioning, right, after some time, the water will diffuse out from the cells into the hypertonic solution surrounding the cells. And the cells will shrink and undergo crenation. This can also cause the death of cells. Okay, so that's why osmoregulation is important, to maintain the blood osmotic pressure in its normal range, and so that the tissue fluid and the intracellular fluid are always isotonic to each other. Right, so hormones are involved in the process of osmoregulation. There are actually two hormones involved, right? So in the mechanism of osmoregulation, the process of osmoregulation is controlled by two hormones. The first hormone is antidiuretic hormone, A from the word anti, D, diuretic, H hormone, okay, ADH, which is secreted by the pituitary gland in the brain. And there's another hormone called aldosterone from the adrenal gland. So both these hormones work together through a negative feedback mechanism to regulate the water and salt content in the blood by reabsorbing either water or salt. All right. For example, the antidiuretic hormone ADH stimulates the reabsorption of water from the urine back into the blood. For a person who has a lack of water in his tissue fluid and blood, he has to reabsorb more water back into the blood. So that is stimulated by the hormone ADH, right? And aldosterone is secreted from the adrenal gland just above the kidneys. It stimulates the reabsorption of salt when a person doesn't eat enough salt in his diet. All right, so the salt will be reabsorbed back into the blood instead of being excreted. More salt will be reabsorbed into the blood instead of being excreted. So the reabsorption of water and salt determine the final concentration and volume of urine. Okay, so these are the two substances that need to be controlled, the water and the salt. But in our syllabus, we are studying more about the antidiuretic hormone and not so much about aldosterone, although aldosterone is mentioned in the topic on hormones. Okay, its function, we must still know its function. So this picture shows us the location of the two endocrine glands that secrete the two hormones needed for osmoregulation, right? Or used in osmoregulation. So osmoregulation by the two hormones. Firstly, the pituitary gland, which is shaped like some grapes, all right? Like two grapes, like that. It secretes the ADH or antidiuretic hormone to stimulate the reabsorption of water from the renal tubule back into the blood in the kidney when a person lacks water, right? And then we have the adrenal gland, which secretes the hormone aldosterone to stimulate reabsorption of salt from the urine in the renal tubule back into the blood when a person lacks salt, doesn't eat enough salt. Okay, right. And then so we have to recognize the shape of the glands also. This is pituitary gland and this is the adrenal gland. That's like a triangle like that. That's a triangular shape. Now it is good for you to understand the meaning of the word antidiuretic so that you understand the function of this hormone. When we say a diuretic, it is a substance that increases the production of urine. So you may have noticed that if you drink some types of drinks, you tend to go to the toilet more often and pass out a lot of urine. Can you name me some drinks that are diuretics, that has this diuretic effect? Yes, drinks like coffee and tea and barley. But when we say antidiuretic, that's the opposite of diuretic. It means that this substance decreases the amount of urine excreted. And that's what this hormone does, the antidiuretic hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland. If the amount of antidiuretic hormone is more, there's more reabsorption of water from the urine back into the blood in the kidney. So less urine will be excreted. Okay, so if the antidiuretic hormone is secreted in greater amounts, it means that the amount of urine excreted, the volume of urine excreted will be less, because there'll be less water in the urine. More water will be reabsorbed back into the blood. So less water, there'll be less water in the urine. So we've already discussed the hormones involved in osmoregulation. Now, another important component in osmoregulation are the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus of the brain. So what are osmoreceptors? They are the special cells that can detect changes in the blood osmotic pressure when the blood flows through the hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus, not hippopotamus. Hypothalamus is a region, small region in the brain, in this tiny projection here, just next to the pituitary gland. Okay, so these two are neighbors, the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will first detect the changes in the blood osmotic pressure by using its osmoreceptors. And from there, the hypothalamus will send impulses to the pituitary gland to determine, to help the pituitary gland to secrete either more or less ADH. Okay, so apart from having osmoreceptors, the hypothalamus also has thermoreceptors, which are specialized cells that detect changes in the body temperature. Okay, so hypothalamus is very important in that it contains these two types of receptors. So many students do not understand the relationship between water, salt, and blood osmotic pressure. It's really very simple. As the concentration of salt in the blood increases, the blood osmotic pressure also increases. It's like a directly proportional relationship. All right. So, for example, if a person were to eat a lot of salty food, like fast food that's salty, or other types of salty food, then the concentration of salt in his blood will increase. And this means that his blood osmotic pressure will also increase. All right, that means the blood will become more concentrated with salts. But if we relate it to water, when the concentration of salt in the blood increases, the concentration of free water decreases. Why is that so? So the water molecules tend to bind to the solute, like the salt, the ions in the salt, sodium ions and chloride ions. So when water molecules surround and bind to the ions in the salt or into any solute, there will be less free water available to be involved in osmosis or diffusion of water from one place to another. So we say that the concentration of the free water will decrease. All right, or just concentration of water decreases. Okay, or we can say the water potential decreases. The potential of the water to move from one area to the other will decrease. Okay, as the water molecules have bound to the solute and is no longer free. Some of the water molecules are no longer free to move around. Okay, so finally, in conclusion, because in this topic we are only going to discussing mainly the regulation of the water in the blood, right? Mostly connected to water. So remember this relationship. As the concentration of the water decreases in the blood osmotic pressure increases. It's an inversely proportional relationship. Okay? And also the concentration of water decreases when the salt concentration increases. Also an inversely proportional relationship. Okay? So if you don't drink enough water in the day, or you lose a lot of water through sweating when you carry out vigorous activities, this means that the concentration of the water in your blood decreases, right? So your blood osmotic pressure increases. That means the blood, you can imagine the blood to be more concentrated, having less water, all right? And that is the condition when the blood osmotic pressure increases. Now, just to recap, what is the negative feedback mechanism? Negative feedback mechanism is a process that occurs in homeostasis when factors or conditions change or deviate from the normal range, such as the temperature of a person increases beyond 37 or 38 degrees Celsius, right? So effectors will carry out corrective mechanisms or responses to reduce the change and bring the factor value, the value of the factor, back to the normal range, right? So example, if a person's temperature were to increase beyond 37 or 38 degrees Celsius, then he'll start to sweat. So the effector is the sweat gland, carries out the corrective mechanism whereby the person produces a lot of sweat, and when the sweat evaporates, it will cool down the body, and then it will reduce the change. It will reduce the rise in temperature and bring the body temperature back to normal. Okay, so effectors can be muscles or glands that carry out the corrective mechanisms. Now, for example, if the value or the level of a factor increases above the normal range, control systems or regulatory systems and corrective mechanisms are activated to reduce the level of the factor or the value of the factor back to normal. On the other hand, if the value or level of the factor decreases below the normal range, control mechanisms or regulatory systems are also activated. Okay, regulatory systems and corrective mechanisms are activated to increase the level of the factor back to normal. Okay, so that's why it's called negative feedback. That means it will cause the change to be reduced. You will cause the change to be reduced, and this will bring the level of the factor back to normal. So this diagram shows us how the negative feedback mechanism works. First of all, there's the normal condition or the factor at the normal value, such as normal body temperature or normal blood osmotic pressure. Now, if the factor value or the value of the factor increases somehow, then this change will be detected by specialized cells called receptors in certain organs of the body. All right, and then the receptors will send an impulse to the control center, usually that's the brain, and then the impulse will be sent out from the brain to the effectors to carry out the corrective mechanisms. All right, so effectors are muscles or glands, and this will cause the factor value or the value of the factor to decrease back to the normal range. Okay, so this process whereby the change is taken away is called the negative feedback mechanism, right? Likewise, if the value of the factor decreases, again, the receptors will detect the change in the value of the factor and will send impulses to the control center. The control center will decide what to do and will send impulses to the effectors like the muscles or gland. So when the corrective mechanism occurs, then the value of the factor will increase back to normal. Now, this is a very complete diagram showing you the process of negative feedback in osmoregulation, which is the regulation of blood osmotic pressure. All right, so we have the normal blood osmotic pressure here, okay, at this point here, and let's say you drink too little water, or there was a loss of water, excessive loss of water due to vigorous activity. That means the person sweated and then lost a lot of water. Okay, whatever it is, the body now lacks water, has too little water in the blood, right? So the blood osmotic pressure increases because there are more, the concentration of dissolved substances will increase when there's less water in the blood, and the concentration of salts will increase in the blood. So the blood osmotic pressure will also increase above the normal range in this case. And then the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus will be stimulated. They will detect the change and they will be stimulated. And then a corrective mechanism is carried out, which we are going to discuss in the next slide, to bring the blood osmotic pressure down back to normal. Okay? Now, on the other hand, if you drink too little water, then the reverse occurs. Blood osmotic pressure decreases below the normal range. Again, the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus, they will detect the change, but in this case, they are less stimulated when the blood osmotic pressure decreases. So the corrective mechanism occurs, which is different from the one above here. And this corrective mechanism helps to increase the blood osmotic pressure back to normal. Okay, so let's find out what happens in more detail when your blood osmotic pressure increases above the normal level or decreases below the normal level. All right, this diagram shows you what happens. Now, let's say you drink too little water, or you carried out some vigorous activity and lost a lot of water through sweating. So your blood osmotic pressure increases above the normal range because you have lost a lot of water and the concentration of salts in your blood has increased. All right, when concentration of water in the blood decreases, concentration of salts will increase. And this will cause the blood osmotic pressure to increase in tandem with the increase in concentration of salts. in the blood. Then the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect the change, all right, because they are the receptors that can detect changes, and they will be stimulated. So impulses are sent from the hypothalamus here to the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland will be more stimulated and it will secrete more ADH, okay, which is the antidiuretic hormone. So this hormone is secreted into the blood and it is transported by blood to the kidneys, right? So in the kidneys, we have the nephron, and the high ADH concentration will cause the walls of the distal convoluted tubule here and the collecting duct to become more permeable to water. That means water can move through the walls of these regions more easily. So more water will be reabsorbed from the renal fluid inside the nephron and inside the collecting duct into the blood. So that means the blood gains back some of the water, right? But it will excrete excess salt, okay? Then the urine produced will be more concentrated because you will have less water in it since more water is reabsorbed, right? So the urine is the fluid that's left in the collecting duct here. You will have less water, so it's low in volume, but it is more concentrated because more salts will be excreted. Okay, more water reabsorbed, but more salts excreted. So this will cause the blood osmotic pressure to decrease. You know, when the more water is reabsorbed, it will increase the concentration of water in the blood, and then the blood osmotic pressure will decrease back to normal. That means it will become more dilute again, but it'll be in the normal range. So take note that when you discuss all this, you must add the word more, like more stimulated, secrete more ADH. The word more must be there, not just secrete ADH. It's relative. You must say either more or less. In this case, it's more. When the person lacks water, his pituitary gland will secrete more ADH to reabsorb more water back into the blood so that he can get back the water. Okay? And he excretes more salts instead. So this is an essay, model essay answer, and this is a past year question. What happens if a person drinks too little water? Some people, they are very busy and they didn't know that they are actually lacking water, so they don't drink water throughout the day. How do you know that you have been drinking too little water? Just take note the volume of urine that's produced. All right, if you are not producing enough, a lot of urine, producing very little urine in the day, it could be that you are drinking too little water, all right? Or if a person loses water by sweating or eats very salty food, this will all increase the blood osmotic pressure above the normal level, right? So osmoreceptors in hypothalamus detect the change in the blood osmotic pressure. They are stimulated and they will send impulses to stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete more antidiuretic hormone. The secret here, or the word here, the key word here is more ADH into the blood. Now always spell out the hormone and don't just write ADH, all right? So you must give the full name of the hormone, antidiuretic hormone. Now high ADH concentration causes walls of distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct be more permeable to water, and more water is reabsorbed from the renal fluid into the blood capillaries. Okay, more water reabsorbed. Take note of the word more. Not just water is reabsorbed. So more water is reabsorbed so that the blood osmotic pressure decreases back to the normal value, and urine produced will be concentrated and low in volume, as more water has been reabsorbed back into the blood. Now discuss another example. Example 2. If a person drinks too much water, what will happen? Okay, plus H2O. Now, so if a person drinks too much water in a day, because some people, they are very conscious about the water intake and they may drink excess, they may have drunk too much water, all right? Excess water and not enough salt. So the blood osmotic pressure will decrease below the normal range. When concentration of water increases, blood osmotic pressure decreases. It's like inversely proportional. All right. So the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus are now less, okay, must use this word, less stimulated when the blood osmotic pressure decreases. Now, the corrective mechanism, the pituitary gland will be less stimulated by the hypothalamus, and it will secrete less ADH, right? So the low ADH concentration causes the walls of the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts to be less permeable to water. So less water is reabsorbed from the renal fluid into the blood capillary, and the urine produced is less concentrated but high in volume because most of the water is not reabsorbed. Okay, so the urine will be very pale in color, almost colorless, and high in volume. All right. Okay, then this will cause the blood osmotic pressure to increase back to normal because now less water is reabsorbed into the blood. So the concentration of water in the blood is not that high as before. Okay, it's low, but the blood osmotic pressure increases. Okay, it's like inversely proportional to the concentration of water. So now we are going to look at the second example of osmoregulation, as we have discussed just now, how to write it in an essay answer, right? This is a past year SPM question 2. Now, so if a person drinks too much water or eats too little salt, what is the process of osmoregulation that occurs? Now, first of all, we just relate it to our daily life experience. We know that if a person, or if we are to drink a lot of water, we tend to go to the toilet more often and pass out urine, excrete urine in great volumes, right? So what actually is the mechanism that takes place that causes this to occur? That's what you need to write here, right? The mechanism of osmoregulation. So firstly, if a person drinks too much water or eats too little salt, the blood osmotic pressure decreases below normal value. Okay, remember, the concentration of water is sort of inversely proportional to the blood osmotic pressure. If you have too much water in the blood, then the blood osmotic pressure does not increase but decreases. All right. So osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus detect the change in the blood osmotic pressure, but they are less stimulated, and they will stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete less hormone, less of this antidiuretic hormone ADH into the blood. So the low ADH concentration causes the walls of the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct to be less permeable to water. So remember to write these words, the word less, okay, most of the time here. So less water is reabsorbed from the renal tubule into the blood capillaries because of the low ADH concentration. So the blood osmotic pressure will increase back to normal value because when less water is absorbed into the blood will have less water inside it, so its water potential will decrease, but the blood osmotic pressure increases. It's inversely proportional, right? These two factors, water concentration, water potential, and blood osmotic pressure, okay, they are inversely proportional to each other. So when the blood has less water in it, its blood osmotic pressure increases. Okay, then but the urine is different because less water is reabsorbed, so more water is now excreted in the urine. So the urine is less concentrated, that means dilute, and high in volume. Okay, right, that's all for this lesson. I hope you have benefited from it. Please do share, like, and subscribe. And we will meet again in the next video. Goodbye for now.